Good evening, everyone. My name is Eva Morales, Multicultural Director for the Student Union Board and member of the Committee on Lectures. It's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's panel discussion. Our co-sponsors this evening are the Student Union Board and the Committee on Lectures, funded by the government of the student body. I'd like to thank both groups for coordinating this event and for hosting the reception following tonight's talk. And on behalf of the Committee on Lectures, I would also like to take a moment to invite you to a couple of final events that we have this semester. Tomorrow night, we will be celebrating the 150th anniversary celebration of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, with panel discussion, Evolution, Why It Is True and Why It Matters, with Iowa State faculty, Drina Dobbs and Jill Pruitz. After Thanksgiving break, we invite you to join us for a talk by plant panelist Pamela Ronald and organic farmer Raul Adamchak, co-authors of Tomorrow's Table, Organic Farming, Genetics, and the Future Food, here in the Union on Thursday, December 3rd. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight's panelists, who co-authored the newly released Postville, USA, Surviving Diversity in a Small Town. As most of you know, in May 2008, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement led a raid on the Agri-Processors Kosher Meatpacking Plant in Postville, Iowa. The raid in Postville, a community of 2,000, resulted in 20% of the residents being arrested and closure of the plant. Tonight's panel members will share their personal experiences with the community of Postville and take your questions. They include Mark Gray, UNI Professor of Anthropology and founder of the Iowa Center on Immigrant Leadership and Integration. Michelle Devlin, Professor of Public Health at UNI and Director of the Iowa Center on Health Disparities. And Rabbi Aaron Goldsmith, a former city councilman of Postville who is currently president and owner of Transfer Master Products, a maker of adjustable electrical hospitable beds. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Eva. Well done. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you come out, and we are very grateful to Iowa State University, according to some legislators, soon to be the University of Iowa at Ames, if you heard that proposal today. So then we will really be sister institutions with the UNI. But it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. I am Dr. Mark Gray, Professor of Anthropology, University of Northern Iowa. And as Eva mentioned, I'm the founding director of the Iowa Center for Immigrant Leadership and Integration. I've had the honor to knock around meatpacking towns in the Midwest for more than 20 years now, and have done so primarily in Iowa ever since I joined the faculty at UNI in 1990. Hard to believe. And of course, I think my favorite town that I've ever worked in and continue to work in is Postville up in the northeast corner of the state. As we try to explain in the book, of course, Postville has undergone a tremendous amount of changes over the last 15 to 20 years or so, some of which have been heavily documented in the media. The arrival of an Orthodox Jewish community in the late 80s and through the 90s, and of course, subsequent arrivals of lots of immigrants and refugees and newcomers from literally around the world. And I think in the last 15 years or so, Postville schools have experienced something like 35 different languages, which is remarkable in any community, but it's certainly remarkable in a community that we think its peak population is around 2,200, 2,300 people. It has been my honor to work with Aaron and Michelle to not only write this book, but Michelle and I have actually been working in and out of the Postville area for more than 10 years, and Aaron will tell you his story here in a minute. He actually lived there prior to that time and actually raised a number of his children there. So amongst us, we have some 30, 35 years of experience living and working in Postville, know the community really well. And it's my honor as well to not only work in Postville and get to know that community really well, I believe, and it's been an honor to know so many people that work with so many people in that community and have an in-depth and I think very personal perspective on what's happening there. The third honor for me, frankly, is to write this book with Aaron and Michelle. And Michelle is a fellow professor at the university. Aaron, as Eva mentioned, is a trained rabbi, but also is in private business and was a former member of the city council. And whenever you write a book with one person, it's a challenge, but you write it with two, the challenges get bigger. And then with three, of course, you have three voices that you have to try to make work together. But I think for the most part, we were able to pull it off, and I'm very proud of what we achieved. You take three unique perspectives on any community, no matter the size, and try to jam it into 200 pages is obviously a great challenge. We felt compelled to write the book prior to the raid of, as Eva mentioned, May of 2008, because of some very remarkable things happening there. The subtitle of the book is Surviving Diversity in Small Town America, but we're actually very proud of what a lot of the things that's happened in Postville over the years, and a lot of, we think, rather unique efforts have gone on there to promote the accommodation of such a tremendously ethnically, linguistically, and religiously diverse population. In the final analysis, of course, what promoted the public demand for a book of this type, of course, came with the immigration raid of May of 2008. But as we'll explain, Postville is not just about the raid. I mean, that was a critical event. The town really suffered because of the raid, and of course, it's still in recovery. But all three of us are optimists. I think we actually did a book launch in Postville on Monday night. Very well received, and everyone in that room was an optimist as well about the future of Postville. So I'm going to ask Michelle to make some comments and Aaron to make some comments, and then I know you all probably have some questions and comments as well. So, Michelle.
Great. Thank you, Mark, and good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Michelle Devlin. I'm a professor, as Mark said, at the University of Northern Iowa, and I'm a specialist in refugee and immigrant health care, and have been working on and off in Postville over the past decade, as well as in a number of other small meatpacking towns in Iowa and in other communities here throughout the Midwest. So indeed, I would say Postville is certainly my favorite. It's been a fascinating community to view over the past decade. Let me just ask you, how many of you have actually been to Postville? Okay, very good. Excellent. Good. How many of you are from Postville? Okay, there's usually a few, and good. Okay, we look forward to hearing.
Now we got to change the whole story.
I know.
Yeah. I want to thank you all for those three people. Please come forward. And
come up here and present with us. Good. We look forward to having your personal perspectives, because it's always neat to have people that have been residents and have seen that community change. How many of you come from communities like Postville in Iowa that are smaller rural towns that have changed? Marshalltown, Perry, Denison, those kinds of places, Storm Lakes, right? You know what we're talking about. Postville has gotten a lot of publicity because of what's gone on in it with demographic change. And unfortunately, a lot of that publicity, as you know, was very negative about a year and a half ago because of the big immigration raid that happened there. It was, at the time, the largest immigration raid in U.S. history. ICE came in with 700 warrants to arrest workers. In the end, they took about just under 400 of the workers there, but they actually, to this day, the number of warrants that they brought with them, 700, remains the largest in American history. So it was quite fascinating to witness what happened in Postville during that raid, and especially in the aftermath. It's an absolutely fascinating story how that town nearly collapsed and is now sort of picking itself up and building itself back together. But we, because we've been working there for so long, we very much believe in the mantra that Postville, it's more than just a raid. In fact, we often tease each other and the local people that were working in relief and rehab efforts after the raid that we should all have T-shirts saying that, Postville, it's more than just a raid, because there were so many members of the media there and the press from literally all over the world. Obviously, Iowan media outlets covered it heavily, but there were, at any given time, would be multiple reporters wandering up and down the streets from from CNN and NBC and the New York Times, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune, BBC, Al Jazeera, I think even at one point talked to some of us. So it was quite fascinating to see all the national and international coverage of the town, because it was an amazing event. And unfortunately, for people that weren't familiar with the town of Postville, it gave a very narrow focus in many cases. Not all. There was actually some exceptionally good reporting, but in many cases, the story was very limited. And it made it sound like it was this little rural town that had failed and really wasn't doing a good job. And, how could they have let these people in, and how could they have, been complicit in having these illegal alien workers, and all the stereotypes and all the stories. And it was really very sad. And we sort of have been fortunate enough to know the broader story of Postville. Again, Mark and I both having worked there as faculty members on and off for a decade. Aaron as being a local community leader, politician, and resident there, and remains a resident now. And so we believe that there is a larger story of Postville to be told. And And indeed there is. It's been an amazing community. And for a small rural town of its size, it's actually per capita had some of the most amazing and progressive projects going on that promote multiculturalism and tolerance and diversity of any community around. Mark and I both spend a lot. I'm from LA, Mark's from Colorado, and Aaron actually from LA and the Midwest, Chicago also. We've traveled a lot, all of us internationally and here domestically, and it's always been quite fascinating to see what Postville has done right. And it did do and continues to do a lot of things very, very well. And again, we believe there is a much broader story to tell. And then Postville also is an interesting case. I know a bunch of you here raised your hands that you're from these kinds of towns. It's simply an example of a lot of this new ethnic diversity that we're seeing occurring in small town rural America. If you're from the bigger states like California, Texas, New York, Florida, you've seen these demographic changes already occurring in the United States population. But what's fascinating is now that a lot of this demographic change is going on even in small town America, like Postville. Postville always got a lot of press because it had this very unique juxtaposition of, ultra-Orthodox Jewish influx of Jews there on top of sort of the local rural environment. It always made for great photographs, great pictures, interesting stories. In fact, National Geographic even covered Postville. There have been a number of documentaries about the town. But in reality, those demographic changes are going on already in a lot of your communities. And you know that if you raise your hand. If you come from places like Marshalltown or Denison or Perry or Storm Lake or other communities like that in the Midwest. Okay, a lot of small town America now looks like Postville for a variety of global labor reasons, which we'll talk about shortly. And Postville actually has, because it's sort of been on the front edge, the leading edge of a lot of this rural demographic change. It's gone through it earlier and more intensely perhaps than many other rural towns have. Postville does have a number of lessons to teach other towns that are experiencing these same population changes. So, and we'll talk about those as well this evening in terms of lessons learned from the case of Postville.
Well, one of the things you learn about writing a book is that you have to be careful what you say, you have to be careful what you write, because if you misrepresent them, then people are going to notice. So I need to first draw attention to something that Mark said that I have to correct. He said that the last 12 years I brought up my children in Postville. They would beg to differ. They think that I've been bringing me up the last 12 years in Postville. And it's been challenging, I can tell that. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is very simply that Postville has an interesting personality. And how many people here have read the book by Stephen Bloom about Postville? Okay, so I moved there before the book was written, and the book characterized Postville in a very sort of unique and I would say almost somewhat cartoonish way, very, very much a lot of caricatures of people, personalities, their customs, their habits. And when I saw the book, I was a little shocked because I saw that Postville had a tremendous beauty to it. It had its own inner harmony. It had its own sort of specialness that just didn't exist elsewhere. I came from the land of Lakers, Los Angeles, where they have a thriving Jewish community. And where else could you find, a thriving Jewish community inside a beautiful rural town where things were nice, people wanted to know each other, they wanted to know their neighbors, and it was just the most amazing sort of paradox to find all these things in one place. So when I moved to Postville, I fell in love with it right away. And all the things that people saw as stress, as strife, I saw as the foibles and fun it takes of people to learn to get along with each other and try to figure each other out. And there definitely was that will in Postville. As time went on, Postville won a lot of awards for diversity, got a lot of recognition for the special things that were going on. And then all of a sudden the raid came, and that sort of changed a lot of people's images. Then sort of everybody rushed in from the different sides and tried to turn Postville into a two-headed goat. They tried to characterize it in ways that I think were completely unfair and completely inconsistent with what the people living there were seeing and experiencing. And, when you have something real, when you have something legitimate, authentic, and substantive, it's not hard to stand up and speak about it. And to the credit of people in Postville, with all the things that we went through, with all the different challenges that we've gone through, there's a tremendous yearning and desire to make things work. And in a lot of America, people have just sort of gotten complacent about their neighbors, complacent about their community, complacent about their surroundings. In Postville, there's still that strong desire to make things work. And I think a large part of what this book was set out to do was to set the record straight, to take the future out of the hands of people on the outside who try to impose an idea and standards and stereotypes on our community, on all our community. And tonight we hope we'll be able to dispel some of those, clarify and dispel and illuminate what's really the beautiful things about Postville. And as my co-authors have said, Postville has a lot to teach everybody else in the United States. I always tell people that in Postville, the American dream still lives. You know, people trying to get ahead, people trying to get ahead in the good old-fashioned hard work American way. And unfortunately, a lot of those people were dragged out through the raid. And this book also talks about that side of it, the side of our tragic immigration policy in this country that just doesn't work. Whatever side you are on the equation of the immigration policy, it just doesn't work. And the tragedies that we experienced in Postville are a powerful symbol of what all the good intentions of the world can really do and bring absolutely nothing but devastation.
Just a 2-minute history lesson about what made Postville unique. Postville is one of dozens and dozens of relatively small rural communities in Iowa that hosted small to medium-sized meatpacking plants. And like a lot of those plants, it could no longer compete against what became the IBPs and the Tysons of the world. The old high-grade plant in Postville shut down in the 1980s. And those of you who remember, you know, it was part of the farm crisis, frankly. We had a lot of these small to medium-sized meatpacking plants and towns throughout Iowa shut down. But a few years later, that shell of a plant was actually purchased by Aaron Roboshkin out of Crown Heights, New York. He was a butcher. They had a plant on the East Coast. They chose to locate to the Midwest, primarily for the same reason that meatpacking plants locate in the Midwest today, and that's to be close to the source of livestock. And through the slow process, the Roboshkin family actually converted that high-grade plant into what ultimately became the largest kosher meatpacking plant in the United States, if not the world. And because of the relative lack of local workers and the growing availability of immigrants and refugees to work at the plant through that roughly 15-year period, the workforce not only in that plant but a neighboring Turkey plant for quite some time became very diverse. And what we found, of course, is that by the time the raid took place in May of 2008, again, roughly two-thirds of the plant's workforce was made up of Latinos. And then what's happened since then, interestingly, and this is another part of the book, is because we were able to actually document what happened to Postville for the year after the raid, was that as Postville in some respects is becoming a post-Latino town. There are actually very, very few Latinos left in Postville. And what we're experiencing what Michelle and I call micro-plurality. So we have a post-Latino community experiencing what we call micro-plurality, which means that we have lots of smaller groups of ethnically and linguistically distinct folks who are coming into the community, a very diverse set of folks, including Somali refugees, folks from larger cities. We're seeing this in Storm Lake as well, people from 8,000 miles away in Micronesia. So again, Postville in many respects reflects what happened in so many meatpacking communities in the Midwest, but of course the principal difference was that plant became, we believe, the world's largest kosher plant. So we'd love to hear what you have to say. Questions, comments. There is a microphone in the middle. We want this time to be as interesting and helpful to you as it can possibly be. This is your night. Have at it. Don't be shy.
Any questions, fair game.
Yeah, there's nothing you can ask us we haven't heard. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. Go ahead. Go ahead, pal. And if you maybe tell us who you are and where you're from.
My name is Mark Bulls, and I have an MA from Northern Iowa. I've never been called shy. I was teaching in Liberal, Kansas, and the Mexican people there, 2/3 of them illegal, said The people in Postville are working for approximately minimum wage or less. They were getting $11.50 an hour to start in Liberal. That's packing meat, and $15.50 to cut the meat. Now, would it be the fact that the wages were so low that you didn't have locals that wanted to work there?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's an excellent
Yeah, it's
question.
an excellent question. Yeah, I think there's a two-prong answer. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I guess there's a three-prong answer. Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. Yeah, it's a fair question. It's been interesting to see how these things have emerged over time, and in fact, it's ironic. You were teaching in Liberal. I cut my teeth in this business just up the road in Garden City, so I watched what happened to that community, and it was interesting how the wage structure of the industry started to change. Even when I was working there in the late '80s or so, and it's been interesting. You're going to find a variety of wage levels within this industry and availability of benefits and so forth. Liberal, I think, was part of what was the chain, the big National Beef, right, National Beef. Yeah, in general, what you found is that if you're part of a larger chain, like the Tysons, the IVPs of the world, you actually saw a different wage structure than you saw in the independents. I think that's part of the answer. Part of the answer is also availability of benefits and that sort of thing. That was differential, and of course, part of this explanation is not just the wage that might have been available in an individual plant, but it was also what we have discovered, of course, is that in any community, in any packing town, what we've seen, of course, is this ongoing struggle to balance how much an employer is willing to pay and how much people are willing to work for. And we're asked this question almost on a daily basis. If they paid more, would more locals take these jobs? And that's a fair question. But what's happening, and we have this, and again, this is a question that we face almost every day, is that we have this ongoing struggle, this ongoing debate about how much any employer is willing to pay and how much locals, if locals are available at all, to take these jobs, and at what wage level are they going to be willing to take those jobs. What's happened, of course, throughout the meatpacking industry is that and this is not unique to Postville by any means, is that the entire industry became very, very dependent on immigrant refugee labor, partly because you had a growing number of people who were willing to work for lower wages. And again, every plant, a lot of plants had different wage structures. But what you had is the industry not only became dependent on those labor, but you actually had a growing cadre, growing cohorts of immigrants and refugees, not just from Latin America, but literally throughout the world, who were willing to take these jobs at wage rates that are lower than probably what local Iowans would accept. That's got to be understood, though, of course, within the context that we have towns like Postville which have been depopulating for quite some time. And so there's and again, this is all about creating a balance and understanding the balance between the availability of labor, how much companies are willing to pay them, and then whether or not and the degree to which people are willing to take those jobs at a particular wage level. And we see that again. Michelle and I are on the road every day, not just in Iowa, but throughout the Midwest, and we hear a variation of that very topic every day. Yeah.
It's interesting because you talk about the wages and at what level will people do this work, essentially, is a basic question. And as Mark indicated, we are, by and large, depopulating, right, in the Midwest, and a lot of our smaller towns are really collapsing from a population standpoint. A lot of people are leaving for bigger cities. Statistically, but how many of you are students? A whole bunch of you, right? So big student groups. Statistically, about half of our students in Iowa leave the state once we graduate from the universities, from the high schools. About half of you will ultimately leave and go into other states and other big cities. So we're depopulating to some extent. Some of these companies literally do not have enough people, period, to do the work. So part of it is that there just simply are not enough people left in some communities to actually have 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 of them working in a plant. But then the other issues, yes, certainly about wages. Absolutely. And it's interesting with this whole post-Latino phase that Mark was describing to you earlier, what we're really seeing now around this state, especially, do you remember the Marshalltown? Do you remember the Swift raid that came before the Postville one in December 06, right? I'm sure a lot of you remember that. Another
06,
big
yeah.
major raid. Some of these meatpacking companies now and ag processing businesses, frankly, are running scared about hiring Latino workers. They're concerned about whether or not they're here legally, illegally, they documented, undocumented. They're running scared. And so they've switched, instead of having towns now that may have had a large white local population, maybe a large Latino immigrant population, those towns are sort of shifting. They're not hiring as many Latinos anymore. A number of those Latinos are leaving, going into other states, other communities, and they're being replaced by this whole micro-plurality set of people. And what makes those groups of newcomers and immigrants and refugees different is that they can work legally in the United States. It's quite interesting. And so now in little towns like Postville or Storm Lake, you're seeing, influx of the Sudanese, of the Somalis, okay, African Americans from Detroit, from Chicago, low-income whites from Appalachia, okay, Native Americans from Nebraska. And these are a lot of the groups that they went to hire after the raid in Postville. The same thing was happening. A lot of the Latinos got arrested, others left, fled. And so a lot of these other groups are being hired to do the work. And what made them unique is that they can work legally in the U.S. They may carry refugee status where they're entitled to work benefits. Maybe they came from places like Micronesia, Palau, okay, out by Guam, Marshall Islands, out in that part of the Western Pacific, which is crazy to think, they're being recruited and brought in thousands of miles away, but they can work legally because they've been part of being, territory status of the U.S. And then you have local people from the United States that are being recruited from down and out areas that are economically depressed, and so they're being brought up to work in these communities like Postville in the plants. So you have this debate, how, are they willing to work or not at those wages?
Yeah. Do you have a question, sir? Please shout it out, brother.
And we can repeat it. Yeah. And if you just want to stay where you are, if you want to say your question, we'll repeat it if that's easier for you.
Yeah. And remember, folks, the microphone is for the podcast as well, so it's not.
Yeah, that's true.
Go ahead, sir, please.
Good evening. My name is Ferro Trabalzi, and I teach community and regional planning here at ISU. I find kind of problematic this idea that people is willing to work in this place. Willing for me is a big problem. I wonder what kind of other chances these people have. Second, it is clear that meatpacking industry now compete on busting unions, and therefore hire these immigrants, first because do not have any other chances to work in other places, and second because they are not unionized. I remember in my own research in Perry, before the Tyson came in, Perry community was nice and cozy with their nice little union worker. They busted the union and started to arrive the Latinos, and then where the problem was. So the whole idea that you are describing here, it seems to me a little bit mystifying of the reality, of the possibility, on the one hand, of this immigrant to work willingly, and second, not recognizing the fact that this meatpacking industry are union busters.
Right. You want me to take that? Sure.
Oh, well, they do have a long history of busting unions. We would agree with you in terms of the industry. And the question is, are local people willing to work in these companies at those wages? And by and large, they're not. One is that, union wage, yes, correct. A lot of you probably grew up with families that worked at these plants. When they did pay union wages, you probably had a father or someone solely supporting the family. Those days are gone. Unfortunately, that's correct. Those unions were busted up.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of these smaller packing plants throughout the state, and one of the things that led to their downfall, frankly, was that we underwent in the 70s what we now call the IVP revolution, where we found larger plants that were horizontally organized and have started to integrate everything from the grain up through the raising of the livestock, and then ultimately adding more value to the product and so forth. And part of the IVP revolution, frankly, was to not just bust unions, but to disempower them. And of course, the last stand for a lot of people point appropriately, I think, at the last stand of of the strong unions in meatpacking at the Hormel plant up in Austin, Minnesota. And there's a brilliant film about that called American Dream, if you ever want to see it. It's just absolutely remarkable. But so yeah, there's downward pressure on wages, and a lot of the interviews that I've done in places like Stormwake, the fellows in the old meatpacking plants, compared to what they were making in the 80s, was about a third in real dollars if you adjust for inflation, that sort of thing. So there's been downward pressure on wages in the industry for more than 20 years now, and so you're right. I mean, there was a great emphasis on this. Now, back to the other question though about the relationship between the disempowerment of unions and immigrant refugee labor. They seem to have risen at the same time. It's interestingly, one of the other parts of the revolution is that we actually moved out into places like Garden City and Liberal. They knew darn well that they were establishing plants where there were lots of cows and there was lots of groundwater, but they didn't have enough labor. When IBP located the largest beef packing plant in the world just outside of Garden City, Kansas, the unemployment rate was 2%. They knew darn well they weren't going to get enough people. So what they did is they started to develop this dependence on refugees and immigrants, principally Latinos, but Southeast Asian refugees and others. And of course that dependence grew. So that also speaks to your first question, your concerns about willingness to take jobs. What do we have, of course, what we've experienced over the last 20, 25 years or so is a tremendous integration of a regional and now a global labor market, where we back in the day when meatpacking jobs were working class, if not middle class jobs, Iowans competed with each other for jobs, and those are jobs. And the old timers would tell you had to know somebody to get one of those jobs, and college students would beg for those. That was the perfect summer job. And a lot of folks, remember those days. And then, of course, when things changed with the revolution and the shutdown of the smaller plants and so forth, then, of course, the downward pressure on wages and so forth. What happened then is you started to tap in some of these other labor sources in Mexico, Central America, later, and then the arrival of the Southeast Asian refugees and so forth. What, of course, they relied upon is that these folks were qualified to take these jobs exactly because they weren't qualified to take some other kind of job. You don't have to speak a word of English. You don't have to have any education. You need no job skills. You don't have to have ever stepped foot in a school in your entire life. And you just had to have the body to physically do the work and the willingness to put your body through that. And so what happened then is this very unique relationship came about where they found people who were willing to take these jobs at the wages offered by the industry. And what that entitled, of course, is that you ultimately this led to a regional labor market for labor, and now it's a global labor market where people literally compete with each other for jobs in the packing industry and other industries, frankly, from people literally around the world. So that's a fair question. But willing's tricky because there's always going to be, most of the people, frankly, who were busted by ICE in Postville came from 3 desperately poor villages in Guatemala where they had absolutely nothing. And as one of the Guatemalans we work with says, when you have nothing, something is a lot. Other question? Somebody asked Darren a question.
I have a question. My name's Claire Wandrow, and I'm a junior in Global Resource Systems. And my question is, you spoke earlier about the unique sort of soul that Postville had before the raid, and I'm assuming that the workers then had an investment in the community. And I'm wondering if the new people who are coming into work are as invested in the community as the people who left.
That's a very good question. In the early stages that these people came from all over the world to work in Postville and later became much more focused on Guatemala, many of them ended up buying homes, working very hard, and their children were some of the highest achievers in the public school system. So it was clear that was what I was speaking before about the American dream, that people came, albeit again we'll ignore the legality of it, but they came with the same idea that our forefathers came to this country to make a better life for themselves. And they became contributors to the community. They became largely positive. I mean, there was an early stage when they first started to get the plant running where they brought a lot of young bucks that would get drunk at night and get in trouble. And then later they started selecting out, looking for family men. And that brought a whole sort of different feeling to the town. And now that there's new owners and they went through a bankruptcy, there was, after the raid, the former owners tried to keep it going. So they brought in all these crazy, what do you call those things?
The recruiting firms.
Recruiting firms, right.
Yeah.
They brought like people from drug houses and all the wild places. They were just people like I have one place there, a storefront, and one guy got so drunk he fell through the front of my store, you know. So it was pretty bad. It was really bad. And then as things went to a trustee and went to now the new owners, they've been very careful who they're vetting. You know, they're going through drug testing, they're going through E-Verify, they're going through all the important things that to see that the people are legal, valid, and capable to do the work. So just now it's starting to see some stability. But no, that we don't have that investment from the new workers right now. We don't have that sense of community yet. And we're hoping that as the plant stabilizes, as they grow, you know, the better workers will work harder and, you know, grow in the ranks and see it's a good place to put roots down and try to make a life for themselves in Postville. Right now, the plant, just to give some perspective, before the raid, there was about 1,000 employees in the plant. Today, I think there's 369. So you can imagine what kind of the economic impact it had on a town of roughly 2,000 people. We have, I know there's 50 vacant houses, maybe 60 vacant houses right now. There was a sea of them that went up for tax sale. And this was a town before where you couldn't find an apartment, you couldn't buy a house if you didn't, you know, you just had to move so quickly. But, you know, through every pendulum of action, you know, we were in a high, and then we went through a low, and now the pendulum's swinging back slowly. So we're seeing that the people, there's less turns, people are keeping the jobs now. It's becoming more stable. Interestingly enough, there's so many stereotypes about what happened. We have a very low crime rate in Postville, in fact, lower than all the surrounding towns, even with all the things that we've gone through. And somehow people in Decorah think that they're going to go, you know, Decorah's 20 minutes away from us. So they think if they drive through, if they stop too long, someone's going to grab their hubcaps, you know. But it's far from that. You know, I mean, Postville's still like you can walk in the middle of the night. I mean, you have to look for trouble to get in trouble. Yeah. So it's still very peaceful and beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Michelle.
Again, my name's Eva Morales, and I'm from Storm Lake, Iowa. I was just wondering, I know that the raid in Postville has some devastating effects on the families in that community. I mean, families were torn apart. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what other communities like Postville, the measures that they're taking, if any, to prepare for the possibility of a raid in their community.
One thing that I would say is critical, when I was on the city council before we ever had the raid, I always felt that Postville was vulnerable because we had such a huge concentration in one business. And I felt that the city should be proactive. We spoke to the community development, the local county, to go out and find smaller companies, 15 to 25 employees, bring them in, diversify our economic base so that you can have some resiliency when something like this happens, because inevitably economics, here it's legality, there's so many different things that can upend a company, and what your question is, can you really prepare for it? I don't think anybody can prepare to lose 300 to 400 people out of a town of 2,000 overnight. It's just, you don't have the infrastructure, it's so damaging. The better thing is not to become dependent on one key supplier. That's the more cost-effective, I think, proactive way to go. It's good to have big employers, but not too big.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Ava, and it's very valid. During the raid, and as things seem to be leading up to the raid with the building of the holding center in Waterloo, where a lot of those arrested would ultimately be detained, there was a lot of buzz and a lot of panic going on between, let's say, groups of immigration lawyers in the state and relief agencies that deal with immigrant and refugee issues. They were all kind of in constant communication, worried about and panicked about who is it going to be, where was the raid going to be. Everyone in that business sort of knew that there was going to be a massive raid happening imminently. And there were, I don't say, incredible amount, but to some extent, some of the immigration legal teams did would held informational sessions about what to do if you're arrested, that kind of thing, what to look out for, what your rights are, where to get help. And then after the raid, a number of people in the immigration law field, and I know it's something we're talking about, you were interested actually in majoring in it. It's a fascinating field to get into and one that's very important. And so that group of people in the state has continued to kind of watch this situation very closely and look at the aftermath, look at the reality of what happened to the community. I've done a lot of refugee work all over the world in some very, very devastated and impoverished areas. And I have to say, in looking at Postville after the raid, for that year and a half or so after the raid, it left such incredible devastation economically and socially and politically and from human terms, from a social standpoint, that I've really never seen anything like it in any of the other places that I've worked. I've seen natural disasters very often create that level of devastation. I've never seen a legal, type of action, an immigration raid, cause that level of devastation. That, in my mind, it was equivalent very much to something like that, because we lived right next to we were affected by the big EF5 tornado that hit, New Hartford, Parkersburg area. That's where our area is, of course, and what happened. So you would drive through Postville and you'd look and you'd think it would be okay, but then right behind all the walls of the houses and the businesses, the town had essentially collapsed. It really collapsed after the raid. It collapsed in part, the raid was massive, especially on a town of only 2,000 people, but then you also had the added issue that the management team itself was, and remember, this is a privately owned company. This was not a large chain like an IBP, Tyson, Swift, where you've got a big bureaucracy. They're national corporations. This was unique in that it was a privately owned, small meatpacking company, world's largest kosher, but still relatively small, privately owned. And so ultimately a fair amount of that management team from a variety of ethnicities, races, religions wound up getting arrested, getting implicated in operating the plant and issues like that. And that plant ultimately went bankrupt. Okay, and so the town collapsed because it was dependent on that one main anchor business, and it really put a lot of people out at work. I often compare the devastation almost to like an earthquake out in California, where I'm from, where you have the initial epicenter of damage, but then you have these sort of concentric waves of harm and damage that continue to be seen throughout the entire community. And so the damage was predictable and disturbing and often took weeks or months to show up. Certainly on the very first day, the most critical people that were affected immediately by the raid were obviously the 400 or so, primarily Guatemalans, that were arrested, okay, and their families that they got separated from. Sometimes you had parents and kids. These people were separated. Others fled. It was an absolute nightmare. Many of the other missing Guatemalans fled to the local St. Bridget's church there, which did a tremendous job in caring for those people. I do a lot of refugee work, and it was really frightening to walk through that church on that day and see 300 to 400 other Guatemalan Mayan peasants shaking. I do a lot of post-traumatic stress stuff, refugee care. You could see them shaking and vibrating in fear, and it was quite disturbing. And then ultimately, other elements of the society there got heavily impacted. You had your local, a lot of the relief work for those people. That all fell on the backs of local providers in the town, local churches, local synagogue, schools, volunteers, champions of diversity, people like that we call, that wound up picking up the mess and trying to carry on. You had a lot of the local business people whose economies, whose income was tied to the plant, that they ultimately got affected too. Their bills weren't paid. They had, outstanding money that they were due, and so that never got paid. And ultimately, large parts of northeast Iowa were severely affected by the raid. So again, there was a lot of blaming going on after the raid, who was responsible, but they were pretty much all united in that this really affected all aspects of the community.
We have another question, sir.
Gerardo Sandoval, I'm a professor in community planning. Any idea why ICE picked Postville? Did they think it was easy pickings? Was it any ideas?
We have lots of ideas.
There's lots of theories.
There are competing theories.
Yeah.
And I think I'll let Aaron explain this, but we may actually know here maybe in the next couple of months or so. But there are competing theories. One is that it was relatively vulnerable because it was a privately owned plant owned by one family. It wasn't part of a larger chain. A lot of the larger chains like the Swifts and the Tysons and so forth have, for the most part, been able to avoid any kind of prosecution and so forth for knowingly hiring and systematically hiring illegal immigrants as laborers, because they've been able to bury a lot of those processes within larger bureaucracies, frankly. And for the most part, those defenses have been successful. We had a disgruntled mid-level manager. We didn't know. It wasn't systematic. So the plant was relatively vulnerable because it was owned by one family. It didn't have a larger bureaucracy to enfold itself. Part of it, frankly, is that you had a small town where you could literally, the town was basically surrounded. The plant was certainly surrounded, but in a de facto sense, the entire town was surrounded the day of the raid, and there continued to be a very, very heavy ICE and other law enforcement present in the community for 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. We've been asked several times if it was because it's a kosher facility. I'm not convinced that's the case. I'm much more convinced that it was vulnerable because it was owned by a single family, and for that reason it was more vulnerable. Do you want to say something about the lawsuit for the ICE?
Yeah, if you're familiar following the trials at all with the Rubashkins, with Shalom Rubashkin, the executive head of the plant which is found guilty on multiple counts of bank fraud, in part of their discovery, they asked for ICE to release the documents of what was the reasons they planned the raid, and ICE basically ignored the request and gave them like 3 pieces of paper on an $8 million plan. You know what I'm saying? They just refused to release the documents. So there's been a lawsuit filed now in federal court for the release of the documents. There's a number of issues that are disturbing about what ICE did, why they targeted Postville, and it's clear one thing, as Mark said, it was a family-owned operation. The family was unsophisticated. They weren't really schooled in worldly corporate things. They didn't understand about public relations. There was a lot of issues and things that made them they just didn't know how to deal with many of the different things that come from the sides. Secondly, there was a number of different groups pressing different agendas on the plant. The union, unions were working very hard to get inside and promoting certain things that were going on in the plant that ended up, some of them in allegations, and turned out to be baseless. But I think you had so many people that were pressing and forcing and arguing about agri-processors that the feds thought there must be this unbelievable mess going on over there, and I think they bought into a lot of the things. Certain allegations like meth labs, running guns, are just completely baseless, but they're printed in the search warrants. So some outrageous accusations that went in there, and some other things that make it hard to understand exactly what was the thinking of ICE. But I hope that the revelation of the documents is going to be more forthright and come forward to see why did they act the way they did, why did they deal with it the way they did, when many people feel that if ICE had come and to the Rubashkins and said, look, in 3 months we're coming back with the helicopters, we're coming back with the buses, we want this all cleaned up now, we want it to stop, we want it to end, it wouldn't have destroyed the whole local economy. It could have affected the same end. Why was it? Was it purely political? Was it something the end of the Bush administration? There's a lot of questions that we just don't know why. But it's clear that anybody that lives in the area or sees what's going on was the impact of the raid absolutely brought no benefit to anybody. It didn't affect anything positive. And it didn't improve enforcement. The collapse of the American economy has done more to stem illegal immigration than anything else, but certainly not I don't think it's anything to do with enforcement.
Right. Another reason we believe they targeted that plant is that, as many of you know, and you'll read this in the book, that after they went into the 700 warrants, they arrested 389, most of whom ended up at the Cattle Congress, and most of them were walked through a plea bargain arrangement, 10 at a time, by the way, through a makeshift federal court where they were given an opportunity to either take their chances in open court at a higher level of felony identity theft or plea bargain out to a lesser charge, still a felony, spend 5 months in jail and then be immediately deported. that script, if you will, that entire process was set up months and months ahead of time. So one of the other theories, sir, is that they chose this particular plant at this particular time and chose to set up this makeshift federal court within this detention, this makeshift detention facility at the Cattle Congress, in order to test that out, in order to test out the process that you don't just go to a plant and bust people, throw them in the bus and deport them, which is the traditional method, but to actually walk them through this plea bargain arrangement. Interestingly, though, that was met with such hostility in the legal community that about 2 months later, an even larger single-place raid was undertaken in Mississippi. They arrested 500 people in a single place. It was a place that made electronic parts. They arrested 500 folks who were working in the country illegally, and all but 8 of them were actually put back into Supreme. I can't read it there.
Supreme Court decision.
Oh, yes, and I'll come back. Okay, yes, thank you. And so what happened then is that they arrested 500 folks, and all but 8 of them were actually put back into traditional deportation proceedings. So they completely chucked this thing that they had experimented with in Waterloo. And then, of course, interestingly, about a year or two late, the Supreme Court ruled that the very law that was used to bust all of the mostly Guatemalans who were arrested in the Postville plant was unconstitutional. Too little, too late for those folks. But again, that's another reason why now they can't use that particular. Right. So while we see, and Aaron hinted at this. We think there was also political motivation for the timing. A lot of people have called this a demonstration raid, not only because of the way that it was done in Postville, but with what I just described in the makeshift federal courts and so forth. What's happened under the Obama administration over the last several months is that they've kind of gotten away from the helicopters and the buses and the handcuffs, and what they've gone now to is what some people are calling a soft raid. A soft raid is basically the ICE identifying folks who work in a particular company who are not eligible to work in this country. They go to the employer, said, we got 800 people. You got 800 employees who shouldn't be working here. You've got a month to fire them or we're going to come in. And that's what's happening now. We've seen this in several places, even in the Twin Cities. I've seen a lot of it in L.A. We're starting to see it in smaller places as well. So there have been some fundamental shifts. But ultimately, as Michelle mentioned, and Aaron too, we've got to get fundamental immigration reform in the nation. We're dealing with a horizon here, the reality now, and the immigration laws that we're dealing with are simply out of date. They're anachronistic. They're 30 years out of date. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm Karen Berman. I teach in the architecture department here. I'm originally from Brooklyn. Clearly, there are enormous problems with federal policy and federal practices in terms of immigration, but it seems to me that's not the only problem here, and I'm wondering if there was not, in the wake of the raid in Postville, also resentment, rage, blame for what, if you believe widespread media reports, were illegal and unethical practices that were going on in the plants. I would like to know what the response was in Postville, because it seems to me that the discussion is all about the federal government, and it seems to me that they're only part of the problem.
Well,
And I want to ask just a second parenthetical question after that. If my father were here, he would say, and was it bad for the Jews? So I would like to know what the impact of all of this is on the Jewish community of Postville, and what is the Jewish community of Postville today?
Yes, excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you for asking. It's fascinating. And actually, I think it's the last chapter in our book, we lay out sort of the 9, main lessons that Postville has to teach other towns. Immigration reform, obviously, is right in there. But then the other main lesson, in fact, our leading lesson, is that the companies that employ these newcomer populations and the way they treat them and the way they work with them, they have to do that in an ethical manner, because these are very often disenfranchised populations. They're very vulnerable. They're very susceptible to being taken advantage of. If you've got companies that are unscrupulous, that are doing illegal things, these are groups that are often not going to speak out especially if they're here illegally, quite frankly. They're not going to go to the police. They're not going to go to representatives and say, hey, we're really being taken advantage of. A lot of that stuff is whispered. It's known under the table, but they're scared. They're running scared. And so there is an obligation. If you've got communities like this and they've got their anchor company and they're employing a lot of these kinds of populations, again, that they treat them ethically and fairly, and are really respectful of their human rights despite what may be going on from a legal issue, whether they're there legally or not. And the other thing related to that, it's important to remember too, although Postville, got all this flack and attention, obviously, for the issue of having undocumented workers, and a large percent of their employees were illegal or undocumented. As I think a lot of you know, that is not unique to Postville, and it's not unique to the meatpacking industry. In fact, you will see that situation across the United States, and what's very convenient for us often to not want to talk about as consumers is that a huge part of our food in this country is packaged and processed and or picked, frankly, by illegal laborers. Okay, and it's a convenient thing to kind of overlook, but again, that gets back to sort of the intersection of globalization and migration and immigration policies that are about 30 years out of date and have not kept up with the reality of the labor market. So yeah, those groups have to be treated ethically. And do you want to talk about the Jewish element?
I don't know why they want me to answer the second question.
You do it, Aaron. Yeah.
We'll help you out. Don't worry.
Most people think I'm Amish, There's a fine balance in your question. It's a very powerful question. And certainly you could realize that I spent a lot of time thinking about that question. That's why I participated in the book, because I felt that if there wouldn't be a voice from somebody Jewish in Postville, that our Jewish community would be completely defined by everybody on the outside. And unfortunately, the conscience of Jews, sometimes it's their beauty and sometimes to their detriment, because sometimes we want to be more responsible for our brother than we should be, and sometimes we're not enough responsible for what our brothers do. It's an interesting paradigm how things go. Ultimately, I'm putting things into certain priority the way that I see them. When I was on the city council, I made myself a set of priorities. What was I there for? At that time, there was huge disputes between the Jewish packing house and the city. They had a major disagreement over waste treatment. And there was a contract that was poorly written, and the city was actually breaching the contract and left the Jewish company in trouble, but the city also had issues with the Jewish company, so it was far from a simple one-way approach. They asked me to join to see if I could help sort it out. So I made in my own mind a paradigm. One, if I felt the issues were based on discrimination, I would speak out. If they were critical of the kosher plant because of business practices, had nothing to do with religion, it's not my problem. It's just not my problem. And really, that's the same story with the book. The interest and the human nature to sometimes to ascribe behaviors to a group because of an individual is often a default in our country, and it's a sad default, because the whole beauty of the Constitution, the whole reason that an Orthodox Jewish Hasidic man could get in trouble in the United States for breaking the law is because of our freedoms. And since his behavior was deemed to be illegal by a court system, so in essence, if we say that all the things that they say in the court are true, then he abused his constitutional rights. And so ultimately, it's not bad for the Jews. Ultimately, it's sad. It's sad. And there are times, this is a more extreme case, but there were times when I felt people would make outrageous statements, like in Bloom's book, once they hired a worker at agri-processors, 2 boys got in trouble, and one they claimed was a rabbinical student, and one was a guy who was in and out of trouble all the time. And one Friday night, they decided to get in a car, which is already a violation of the Jewish principles, and they held up a grocery store and they shot somebody. So Bloom kept saying all the time, in his book, this crazy assertion, and the Jewish community never apologized for this, and all this. So I used to ask people, I said, what church is going to apologize for Jeffrey Dahmer? You know what I mean? Like, behavior is individual. That's free choice. The beauty and freedoms of our country is that people can do what they want to do. And if they don't do them correctly, they pay a high price. Unfortunately, I think it's really sad what happened. And the other double tragedy of like what's happened with the Rubashkins, they were giving people. But if they weren't complying with the law and the law was broken, ultimately they have to face those consequences. So you can't wash away, you can't do on one side a good thing and the other side do something wrong and think that they're going to equal each other and bring you back to neutral. You know, you have to do what's right. You have to be on your best behavior and you have to earn the respect of everybody. And if you fail in that, that's ultimately an individual's own purview. So as far as the Jewish community is concerned, there's a big mixture of feelings right now in the way he's being handled in the trial. Because you see, Linda Reed is the one who organized this process that Mark explained about the Guatemalans had to plead to this or plead to that, which ultimately was deemed unconstitutional. So she's the one who's judging Sholem Rubashkin. So many people feel that she should have recused herself because she was already on the front end of the judge who oversaw the whole raid. So that's kind of like somebody who has a bit of an agenda, and I'm not saying she's done anything inappropriate, but just raises a lot of flags. And they were afraid to ask her, I know the defense was afraid to ask her to recuse herself from the court because they thought they're going to irritate her more because one of the lower level managers who did get prosecuted and judged by her tried to ask her to recuse and she wouldn't do it.
Right.
So they felt they had no choice. And so that the Jewish community feels a bit uncomfortable about. They say, you know, let Sholem be judged, but let him be judged by an impartial court. Let him be judged, you know, without political agendas. And so there's some mixed feelings about, you know, is this a carryover? Is Sholem going to pay this high price because, you know, whatever it was? You remember when the raid hit, it was very challenging because the governor immediately jumped out and started screaming about how terrible it was and it's not going to happen in his state before anybody knew all the truth of the allegations. So there was a tremendous political prosecution that started before the court ever, the trial ever came. And it's very uncomfortable for the Jewish community because there they just didn't feel they're getting a fair shake with, you know, the Rubashkins weren't getting a real fair shake. And again, they need to be responsible for what they did. They broke the law. They need to be dealt with like any other person. But just to give perspective, right now they found him guilty that he'd have 1,200 years he'd have to serve if she throws the book at him. In the meantime, you know, like this guy who was working with Al-Qaeda killing Americans, they only sentenced him to 8 years. But, you know, for this case, somehow they've amplified all the charges. It was a single loan. They turned it into like 81 counts. And in most cases, it would be like 7 counts. So there's a lot of very uncomfortable feelings, you know, and so it's hard to separate the community from the individual and the process and the treatment that he's getting. And there's a lot of questions that have to be still asked and a lot to seek true justice for everybody.
Ma'am.
Hi, my name is Sue Foster Hinsey, and I grew up in Postville. And my parents still live in Postville. My father was a teacher in Postville, and my mother today helps run the food bank.
Very good.
We're sure we've met her. I'm sure
Yeah, we
we've met her.
probably
Probably
know her.
you did.
Tell her thank you for her work. That was greatly affected after the raid.
She's worked there a lot. I was actually in Postville the day of the raid, visiting, and I have to confess, I did not know what was happening at all. But we had left town with a friend, and when I came back, we found out. And it seemed like the town was just numb. You know, I knew we were, and, you know, it was like, what happened? So it was very shocking for everyone. But I've had the opportunity to watch Postville grow, how it's changed, evolved. It's been interesting, I think. I know a lot of the people there. I still go back there. I guess one of the things that I'm wondering, though, is, I've learned a lot about Postville just from my parents, is some of the ways that when they would have the workers come and the places that they end up staying. One of the rumors that I heard was that a lot of them they had to live in a house that was owned by people that ran the company, and they would have to rent the beds and share their beds. And so they would have to pay for their way there, or the company would pay for their way there, so then they'd have to pay the company back. So in essence, they wouldn't get a paycheck for several weeks. I'm not positive if this is true, but I was wondering, is there any changes? Will this be the same?
Sure.
Yeah, first off, that only started after the raid, and it was with those recruiting agencies who took it all A to Z. And in my opinion, they were completely exploitive, outrageous, and they're disgusting people. And that happened after the raid because the owners of the company never forced people to rent from them, go to their houses, or any of those kinds of things. That I think it's clearly documented. And it was Force One was one of the groups, and a number of groups, and it was worse than what you say. It was worse than what you say.
Yeah.
In fact, they got paid on this little card, right? Even when they went to take their pay, they'd get like a $5 charge every time they took their money. So every which way they were coming or going, their money was being stolen from them. And they would take houses and put men and women sometimes in the same houses and the same places. It was terrible. It was a disaster.
Yeah, it was. Though, yeah, by and large, those stories that you heard are accurate. That was very much part of the ugliness and collapse that Postville fell into. And again, and these are, like we said, very vulnerable populations. They're not going to complain. They're scared. They have very little power, and they were completely taken advantage for economic profit by the recruiting companies or by local companies there that were into the, kind of housing speculation and rental thing, and it just became very sloppy and messy and horrible. But those were very, very horrible conditions, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now with the new owners, the plant has since been bought, has a new owner, another family now that owns it. It's interesting. They have very much taken a completely different perspective. The Rubashkin family before, the one that got ultimately arrested and charged, and they very much operated Postville more as a company town in terms of they were very active certainly within the Jewish community. They helped provide housing. They helped pay for the Jewish school and the Jewish store and other facilities there for the local rabbis and others that had to do the slaughtering. The new owners seem at this point less willing to get involved in the community, no matter how you define that. Be it the Jewish community, the local community, the immigrant work, whatever, all those different groups, they seem to be less willing to a certain extent to get involved with them. So at the same time, that might not be a good thing. At the same time, though, it probably means they're not going to be getting into the side businesses like running rental properties and
They've said they won't do it.
yeah, those kinds of things. So maybe that's a good thing. If you can't do it well, and again, treat these people with the human rights that they deserve them, maybe you shouldn't be doing it at all.
That 6 or 7 months after the raid,
It's horrible.
It was horrible.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons.
Those stories
yeah.
are accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We interviewed several people who got paid on the cards. And if you quit or you got fired or something, you couldn't withdraw your money that they owed you to even get out of town. And there are a lot of ethical issues surrounding that as well. Yes, ma'am, please.
Yes, I'm Ellen Arkovich. I live here in Ames. I was wondering, as I remember, Stephen Bloom portrayed the community when it was first starting as the Jewish community was keeping to themselves and not integrating with the non-Jewish community. Was this an accurate portrayal? And how is the community, the Jewish community, involved with the non-Jewish community today?
Well, I think it was taking half facts and spinning it the way he wanted to spin it. For example, before the book was released, I know I was in the Chamber of Commerce, I was in some other organizations, but a large amount of the Jewish workforce, he neglected to say in the book, didn't speak English. Okay, and it's a very big barrier for people socially. Many of them were from Israel, some of them were from different countries besides the United States. So many of them were, I would say they didn't have a lot of social skills. And many of them also came, you see, one of the misnomers about Jewish workers in a kosher slaughterhouse, they may have the title rabbi. When you hear the title rabbi, you think of somebody who's a priest, a minister, somebody who tends to a crowd. Well, a ritual slaughter is a vocation. It's a skill. It's a blue-collar worker to some degree. It's a high-level blue-collar worker. But you're not talking about the top of the guys, the top of the class. You're not talking about the most socially upwards type of people. You're talking about people that are, have very limited skills, very limited social skills. And so coming to a place like Postal, they wouldn't know how to relate. So it wasn't, that's to me is the twisting of the truth. It's implying that they wanted to be separate. They wanted to not this was the plan. I would say it's the reverse is the case. They are afraid to do it. They didn't want to embarrass themselves. They didn't know how to express themselves. They didn't know what the customs were. And there are many, many decent people in town who know, many of the people the Jewish community will know today that they can see the difference between the vocational guys and the guys who are, easygoing and can shoot the breeze and talk about anything and are involved in things. So I think that's, again, it was a spin rather than the truth. And it could reasonably feel like that. If you didn't know these things, it would feel like that. And I totally respect the fact that some people could perceive that. But he's a professor. He was supposed to research it, and he didn't choose to spin it, I think, in a forthright fashion.
Well, yeah, I do believe there were legitimate, cultural differences in terms of just the norms of getting used to each other, knowing what's expected, not expected within a particular cultural group. What was interesting is that most of the Jewish population that came into Postville, many of them were ultra-Orthodox. And so by default, they tend to be a tighter group. They very often rely on themselves. And, a lot of some of the local Postville people had not interacted with Jewish populations ever, and that was sort of their only idea of who Jews are and what they are. They had no concept of conservative Jews, Reform Jews, and the complexities. One of the main points we talk about a lot in the book is this importance of diversity within diversity, and there just are no homogenous populations. The Jews there are as diverse as any group ever. The local primarily white Christian Postvillians are incredibly different from each other. The Latinos are very different, and all these. There's a lot of individuality and a lot of ethnic pride and differences among all of these populations.
Just for information, my son was the first Orthodox Jew who was an EMT. My daughter was on the Board of Adjustment, and there are many other people who are involved in different things in the community, just so perspective. Now I think there was a guy who was in the fire department. One of the Jewish guys got into the volunteer fire department. So again, it depends on the person. Just like any other population, you have many people who also in Postal have never said hello to me ever. I've said hello to them about 5,000 times just out of curiosity. I'm still waiting for the answer,
Yes, sir. Another question, please.
Yeah, I'm Tim Graham. I'm a senior in Ag Studies here. I was just curious on your guys' views on the community there in Postville and the surrounding communities, and how they viewed the illegals. Did they accept them? Did they resent them before and after the raid?
I can answer that with an interesting metaphor. We had, the months, years leading up to the raid, of course, the bulk, but not all of the local workforce was made up of Latinos. And that community, by and large, was actually doing very well. They supported several, probably at 1.8 or 9 different businesses. The raid happened. Most of those folks either arrested and pulled out of the community, or they fled, or they kind of trickled out of the community. And then when all these knuckleheads started showing up a few months after the raid that we've been describing, local Postvillians were turning to people like us and saying, we miss our illegal Guatemalans. They kept to themselves. They kept, kept pretty quiet lives. They were family-oriented people. I mean, their goals were very plain, that they were there to work, they were there to provide better opportunities for themselves and their children.
Not transient.
And they were not transient. They, as much as possible, they had settled into the community. So that's the metaphor. And of course, we're confronted all the time as well about, if everybody in town knew they were illegal, why didn't they do something about it, and so forth. I mean, what are they supposed to do? We're confronted with this question. We did some training out of Western Iowa with the law enforcement last week. Well, what are people supposed to do about that? I mean, they said people are using the word they tolerated it in Postville. Well, of course they tolerated it. What else were they supposed to do about it? I mean, there's always an interesting mixture, of course, of perspectives about this. But by and large, for the most part, things had settled in pretty well in the year or two prior to the raid. Go ahead. You want to say something?
And again, this issue of having undocumented workers, it is not unique to Postville. It's not unique to the plant. I think most of you know that the large proportion of these employees in these companies are here undocumented.
Yeah, and I'll make something else clear about this, because this is something, again, that Michelle and I deal with almost on a daily basis, is that people are in the country illegally and find themselves in places like Iowa are not here to get away with anything. They're here because we employ them. We provide incomes for them. And there's a legitimate debate about whether we should do that, and that's a fair debate. But the bottom line is they're not here to get away with anything. They're here because we employ them. And what we're finding, it's not just in towns like Postville and the Marshall towns of the world, but even in very conservative, very, very, very conservative communities that Michelle and I find ourselves working in, there's now this interesting dialogue, is that the way to put it, dialogue between the employers who still want access to those kinds of workers and who are very major players in the local economy and local politics versus the establishment that says this is completely and absolutely inappropriate. And the struggle that goes on between those two is actually become very poignant, frankly. So you still have a great deal of demand for those kind of workers. We all know, it's very interesting, we've been tracking now for a few years now that whenever there's a large natural disaster like a hailstorm or the floods in Cedar Rapids and so forth, the people we have roving mobs of Guatemalans who follow these disasters, and they're the ones who are cleaning things up. And as Michelle mentioned, as consumers, we benefit from this. My law-abiding, God-fearing neighbor just had his roof fixed by Guatemalans, and I know they're all in the country illegally, but because they were under contract, he didn't have to worry about his conscience and having hired illegal immigrants. Yeah. Do you have a question, sir? No? Did we answer your question? That means we're getting on in the evening when we answered our own question. Who else? Yes, sir. Shout it out, brother. Shout it out.
We'll repeat it.
Right. The question is,
Sure.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Is there lingering anger in town, and at whom is it directed?
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Who's?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's fascinating, and I'll let Aaron give you more personal perspective, but it's interesting to see there are lots of different opinions about who to blame. Some blame the company, itself for hiring these people. In fact, what you'll often hear is the Jews hired them. Of course, it's one family. Okay, but the Jews hired you. So you'll hear that kind of thing going around. You'll hear other people blame the Postvillians themselves. They knew very well they were profiting from taxes and the business. They should have known. They should have kicked them out. That kind of thing. You'll hear people blame the illegal aliens. Why are they here anyway? So you get lots of diverging views. But the one thing, no matter what race, ethnicity, gender, economic class, religion they may be from, almost all of the local people seem to be united in that they feel that ICE was far too strong. It may have had, the legal right to do that. It may have been a legitimate issue to look at, but virtually all of them are united in that this was way too strong of an action for a little town of 2,000 people. And ultimately, they arrested those 400, but it collapsed an entire region, and everyone, no matter what race, ethnicity, religion, again, was ultimately affected.
Communities break into three parts. There's 20% of the people that are adapters and embrace change and see the opportunity. 20% of the people, they'll fight you tooth and nail to do anything because they're against anything that's going to change or do anything different. And there's 60% of the people are waiting to hear who's going to have the loudest voice, and they often get drawn by the two strong extremes. No problem. So what's happened is that I think, Postville has what I call this angry element. And we had a really proactive city council before the raid, very effective, did a lot of things, accomplished a lot. And every political wind has its cycle. Even if, Americans are funny people. Even when things are going right, they decide it's not going right. They want change. They want to do this. They want to do that. So the angry voices sort of came in, and the angry voices came and they undermined a lot of things that were working well. Now we had another election, and pretty much the angries got swept out, and now there's this positive cycle again. But I could tell you that I'm there long enough and close enough to a lot of people. I got a phone call the other night from one of the older women in town, and you'll probably figure this out, but her son's business was next to a major fire. We lost a bakery in town. It was a major fire. And the two businesses on the right and the left took smoke and water damage, and the one business took a lot of damage. So I went over to the husband and wife that owned it and said, I don't know what your circumstances are. I've got space in my warehouse. Whatever you need our machines, whatever we can do, we're happy to help you, you know. So this guy, after the raid, came to me, and he told me after the raid, he drove up to my house, and he drove up and he said, I don't want you to leave. I said, I hope that this raid is not going to destroy the Jewish community. He said, I'm closer to you than I am to my own brothers. And I hope that you're not going to take this as a bad sign and leave, and don't think that all the people in Postville are angry at the Jews. I said, this guy's mother called me yesterday, okay? And she called me up and she said, I know what you said you did for my son, but I know for years and years, you and many of your friends in the Jewish community care about Postville. We don't want you to leave. And she said, I have a lot of people come to me who want to blame everything on the Jews. And he said, I never stop telling them they're wrong, don't think like that, don't act like that. She said, for my part, I just want you to know that you're as much as Postville as anybody else, and don't let anybody else think otherwise. And so that comes back to that's three groups. When I ran for city council, I chose to speak to the 20%, the early adapters, and the 60%. I did not talk to the people who were angry because I knew I had no answers for them. Because no matter if I'm going to say this, they're going to say that. If I'm going to say this, I'm going to say that. I knew there's nothing to do. I can only talk to the people who wanted to make their lives better. And that group, I think, still is intact, that people that are angry. And this is just another Trojan horse for them to express all their bitter feelings about people they don't want around. And before the Jews came, they expressed it maybe about the Protestants or the Lutherans or the Catholics. You can pick whatever group. But there's always a target for this anger. And that's really what I saw and experienced.
Let's take two more questions. Sir, please.
My name's Chad Nelson. I'm a senior in computer engineering. And I have a view on immigration policy.
Okay.
I don't hold on to it very tightly, but I want you to
analyze. You got a whole notebook there, pal. How long is this view on it?
It's not
Go ahead.
long.
We want you to fix it.
But my view relies on my knowledge of economics and resource allocations for nations. So like in China, they have a large labor force, but they don't have a lot of capital. And in the United States, I feel like we have a very small labor force and a lot of capital. And so the immigration policy that I think would make most sense with that economy would be to bring in the best and the brightest from other nations and keep our labor rate high because there are less workers. And then having a high labor rate would promote modernization and labor-saving technologies that would be invented by people like me, computer engineers. So like in the case of a meat packing plant, instead of hiring Guatemalans or other people who are part of the unemployed mob of other nations that are over other nations keeping their labor rates low, we should be hiring computer engineers to build modern factories that use a lot of labor-saving technology. So that's my immigration policy. Is it a legitimate policy or not? Does it ignore globalization? Is it our responsibility to help those that aren't employed?
Those are excellent questions.
They're excellent. I'm going to let Mark answer this.
Thank
but
you.
I know it's a
I
long
just want to
question.
compliment you as a young student that you're actually thinking that deeply about this issue. That's far more than what we're seeing among some of our elected officials that are really trying to figure this stuff out. It's time to start thinking about some creative ideas.
Yeah.
You said thinking in the beginning, so I already forget political career. That don't work.
That's right. Aaron says, don't run for office. Well, the short answer for this in meatpacking is actually relatively unique. You're absolutely right that there have been ongoing efforts for years to try to mechanize and automate as much as possible the meat packing process. And a lot of those machines have been created. A lot of them are actually in place. But the bottom line is every carcass of every animal is sufficiently different that human beings have to do the things that the machines can't do. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of these kinds of processes. And that's why you need so much labor in a meat packing plant, frankly. Again, the mechanization gets more sophisticated all the time. We're actually going to see some investments in that more advanced kind of mechanism in the kosher plant in Postville. But the bottom line is when you cut up animals, when you kill, when you slaughter, process, and process an animal, every carcass is going to be somewhat unique, and there are always going to be some things that a human being has to physically do. And so I appreciate your point, and there are geniuses like you who are working on this. Trust me, every day, and I've talked to these people, and there are brilliant engineers out there who are working on these products every day. But as long as we don't clone animals so that they're all the same, and that's a hint to any other geniuses in the room, learn how to clone animals for the meat packing industry, right? Then you're still going to have this problem.
Right.
Yeah.
But like if you limit the labor that you import into the country, the labor rate will get high enough to the point where it will incentivize people to engineer ways.
Yeah.
But you got one caveat that you're missing, and is actually something that he also talked about, is that as long as you don't have walls for trade, like if you can get a kosher chicken from China, you're not going to pay top wages here, and so there's a multi-dimensions to the question, because you can't look at any one part of it alone. You have to add all the pieces together.
Which is why I was asking if it ignored the globalization.
I'm sorry. I think you have a valid point for certain industries. What happens a little bit differently with the kosher meatpacking process in particular is that in order to make it kosher, one of the things that has to be done is that they have to be slaughtered by hand by one of these rabbis that Aaron talked about. So actually, even though conditions were not great in that kosher meatpacking plant, those plants, you understand, are among the most dangerous jobs in the entire country, right up there with crab fishing, okay, that type of thing. They're very dangerous. The actual speed at which the animals are killed in a kosher plant, because it's done by hand, ritually by a professional slaughterer, is actually slower even than what we are seeing in other non-kosher companies where they are trying to mechanize more, and they've gotten quite mechanized. So I think to a certain level they are taking, your lead on that. But again, I really want to commend you for, trying to think about those issues. Keep it up.
Yeah.
Keep it up, please.
Thank you for your comment and your Dr. Flora.
Hi.
Good
Thanks
to see
for
you.
cutting off after me, Mark.
Yes, sure.
My question has to do with sort of what the larger implications are, and particularly what happens with the folks who I think are clearly here to work in the U.S. because we do have those kinds of jobs that other people don't want to fill. And in addition to that, we also have an aging population.
Right.
So we can look at immigrants as a positive force. I think the real problem is I'm a little discouraged about the possibilities of comprehensive immigration reform as I look at what's happened with health care reform, how difficult that's been. And so the Obama administration has said that they won't do any of these large workforce raids, but they also said that they would target employers.
Right.
And the other thing that they're doing is an awful lot of residential raids, which scares people just as badly if they're here without appropriate documents, and scares relatives of theirs who get arrested, and some of whom are even citizens. My question really is, if we don't get comprehensive immigration reform soon, what are the political approaches that we need to use to make this broken system that we have a little bit more humane?
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent point. Well, two quick responses. One, in light of comprehensive immigration reform, what we have now is a real scattershot approach where even from community to community, even in Iowa, you see different not only just political and theoretical perspectives on this, but actually the degrees to which, for example, law enforcement are willing to actually enforce immigration law. So you literally forgo from one county in Iowa where the sheriff says that's the Fed's job. If we pick somebody up for a particular crime and there's a warrant out for their arrest, we'll call ICE to the county next door, which even a local police chief of a small town will consider it his or her responsibility to enforce federal immigration law, and then of course everything in between. So you got a lot of scattershot, but you're absolutely correct. Frankly, I was very hopeful a year ago that we'd actually head towards comprehensive immigration reform, and a lot of these problems would be dealt with. But given the rancor over the health care bill, and you remember what happened in the summer. This is only 2 or 3 months ago when these proposals were bubbling to the surface. The two things that killed it, all the rancor in the town hall meetings and the August recess and so forth, the death panels, which were a total fabrication, but nonetheless, people, this was raising the rhetoric, and illegal immigration and the debate whether or not illegal immigrants were going to have access to health care under these new bills.
There was some debate that they wouldn't even let them buy insurance with their own money, and so the Latino caucus and congressional got very, very angry about that and said that, that's really taking it too far. That's an insult.
Right. Yeah, and so it's interesting to see how the politics have played out over last year or so. Obama got elected. Okay, here we go. Happy days are here again. They recognize, even the Republicans have recognized the long-term political benefits of dealing with comprehensive immigration reform. They understand the growing cloud of the Latino community, the Latino vote, and so forth. And everybody's going to figure this out. But and it's been curious. In fact, we were driving in the car over here talking about where did all of these things go? Where did the agenda go? All of these things that were going to happen in the Obama administration and at this have gone nowhere. He's been in office almost a year, and so even though a lot of people have recognized for practical and theoretical reasons that we absolutely need comprehensive immigration reform, there are no serious proposals on the table. There are some things that are languishing in subcommittees in Congress, various subcommittees in Congress, but nobody's willing to take any risks. Nobody's willing to stick their neck out in this thing because they saw what happened in the August recess. And so we're left, and again, Michelle and I have these discussions almost on a daily basis. And it's not just law enforcement, it's local officials, it's employers, it's chambers of commerce. They're having these arguments for themselves. Well, you've got neighbors who say, they run a dairy farm, I need people to work here. These people are willing to work here, and I can still hire them at a profit. On the other hand, I got the police chief who's called ICE on me every time I've hired somebody. And you have this inherent tension, even within these relatively small communities, about, which has left everyone in the lurch, frankly, because we don't have comprehensive immigration reform, because it doesn't address these very issues that you outlined. Absolutely. So, any other response?
Ava wants to say something.
Ava, there's some talk about doing guest worker programs, which can work in some situations, and it has worked in some countries. One of the challenges with those kinds of programs, though, if they're not done well, is that you almost have sort of this very much an itinerant workforce that just rotates in and out, over a short period of time. And they're even less vested in a community than a lot of these people that have been here for many years, frankly, legal or illegal. They've been here for a long time and are often, like they were in Postville, very much members of the community. So, it's been very frustrating because there's no real...
Oh, yeah, H-2A, oh, yeah.
You bet.
Sure.
You better believe it.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, there's a non-seasonal temporary worker visa that people can get. Ski industry, Christmas tree industry, a lot of people, and those folks have they have absolutely no rights whatsoever. They are notoriously abused. So yeah, the guest worker proposals are interesting, but those of us in the business have actually not. Most of us in the business have actually not been proponents of those for the reasons that Michelle outlined. Postville very much became caught up in this lack of immigration reform, the ongoing debate. Was it indeed a demonstration raid? And Michelle's right, you know, and ICE actually had the legal authority to move in and do what they did. But I guess if I had to make a closing comment is that the immigration system in our country is so broken that ICE probably spent millions and millions of dollars on this, planning it, the makeshift courts, retrofitting the cattle Congress, marching these poor people through these makeshift courts, putting them in jail for 5 months, deporting them, and they didn't spend a dime on what happened to the community. There was absolutely no thought whatsoever for what happened to the community. And of course, who ended up picking up the ball? It was the synagogue, it was the Lutheran Church, it was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church alone collected $1 million in private donations to help these people from 49 different states and a couple foreign countries. It's like your mom in the food bank. Everyone else had to pick up the pieces because they came in, again, they had the legal right to do it, but there was absolutely no forethought and obviously no resources given to the community to deal with the mess afterwards. So thank you for your comment.
Very tragic story. But thank you very, very much for your interest in tonight's
thank you, Eva.
Story. Thank you. Thank you.
Good job, Eva.
Our solution actually to immigration reform is give people like Eva and our young man over here, these new young students that are really into these issues, get them elected into positions of power and policy.
And we'll go bass fishing.
Yeah, we're good. And we can retire.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you very much for your comments. It's been a pleasure having you on our campus.
Thank you.
Before we wrap things up, I would like to inform everyone that the University Bookstore does have copies of Postville USA for sale this evening right through these doors. And I'd also like to invite all of you to join us for a reception and book signing following very briefly.
Where is that, even there or here?
Right back there in this room.
Thank you, Eva.
All right, thank you very much. Let's give our panelists another round of applause.
Thank you very much. Wonderful audience. Thank you. Thank you.